Welcome to Tate Modern. It's great to see so many people here on this lovely evening. I'm Liz Ellis, I'm Curator of Community Learning here in Public Programmes at Tate Modern, and I'm really delighted to welcome you all here for this evening. I'm really proud of the fact that this is our third annual collaboration with London Arts and Health Forum, and I just wanted to give a little context for the ways we've been working together over the years. Here in Community Learning, we're really proud of the fact that we have many partnerships with NHS trusts, with artists, with health organisations, with policymakers. And working with London Arts and Health Forum gives us a fantastic opportunity to be able to host events such as this, training programmes, all sorts of ongoing events, both with artists but also people involved in health and policy areas. So some of these areas, just thinking last night of a conversation at House of Commons with Gus O'Donnell and the wellbeing report, some of these areas of wellbeing are creeping up and up the political agenda. So for this year's annual lecture, which marks the closing of a fantastic Wellbeing Creativity Week hosted by Laugh Throughout London, we're really proud to welcome Lionel Shriver and Professor Deborah Bowman to have a conversation and to have opportunities to talk with all of us about some of the ethical issues, some of the cultural issues emerging out of some of these agendas of arts, health, wellbeing, culture. So here at Tate Modern, we're really interested in modern and contemporary practice, how literature, how dance, how film, how performance also engages with political critical thinking. And just to give you the format for the evening, Deborah and Lionel will be in conversation for perhaps 25 minutes. We'll then have opportunities for questions. Just so you know, we're recording the whole event. So when it's the opportunity for questions, if you kind of can hang on, Deborah will be looking out for you, the fact you'd like a mic, and my colleagues will have roving mics for you to use. But if you can just kind of hold off, because we're recording the whole event, don't ask the question until you've got the mic. That would be great. And then we'll be joined by my colleague, Damien Hebron, Director of London Arts and Health Forum, who will say a few words before we all move to have refreshments out in the Starr foyer. So without further ado, a really big welcome to you all. And I'd like to ask Professor Deborah Bowman and Lionel Shriver to join us on the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this event. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. I'm delighted to be talking this evening to Lionel Shriver. Many of you will know her work. She's the author of 11 novels, titles including The Post-Birthday World, A Perfect Family, We Need to Talk About Kevin, Orange Prize winning, Big Brother, and so much for that. I also wanted to draw your attention to a short story that Lionel was shortlisted for last year called Prepositions, which I think is as astute observation of death, grief, and the moral value we attribute to death and grief as any I've ever read, and you may not know that. If you haven't read her work, start anywhere. It will be rich and rewarding. If you have read her work, go and reread it. It always bears rereading. What we're going to do is, I think we're actually going to talk for slightly longer than Liz maybe said, if that's all right. It's like, yes, that's all right. Nothing like a little improv on stage, is there? We're going to talk for slightly longer, but we will be finishing to leave time for questions at the end, about 7:30. Lionel's going to read to us at various points during the evening, and we hope that we're going to cover a wide range of subjects, but you will have the opportunity to ask any questions that you think I've missed out, or if to comment on any of the responses or points that have come up. So Lionel, I wanted to begin really by thinking a little bit, it seems to me that in your work you've covered lots of themes that are relevant to people in this audience, are relevant to human beings. So you've talked about connectedness, family, lonely, marginalisation, all those sorts of things. And I was thinking there are lots of novels about health, but there aren't that many about healthcare systems. So how did you come to think, yes, the American healthcare system, that's what I'll write?
Well, I should clarify that whenever anyone describes my ninth novel, so much for that, is about American healthcare, they unsell another 100 copies.
I'm sorry. It's marvellous. It's marvellous. And there's wonderful human narrative in there too.
I mean, it's a novel about wider issues than the U.S. healthcare system, but it does involve the U.S. healthcare system, and it's about a family that starts out, actually, by most people's standards, pretty well off. They have some money set aside, and the protagonist has always wanted to escape to a third world country where his little nest egg will last forever because things are so much cheaper there. And then his wife gets sick. And all of the money that they've saved up is steadily eroded by the expenses that American health insurance doesn't cover. And it's sickening. So that each chapter begins with how much is left in the Merrill Lynch account. And numbers have a certain pathos of their own. And I think toward the end of that novel, when you turn the page and you get to another, oh my God, it's not boring. And in fact, I think that's one of the things that fiction can bring to a lot of the issues that Deborah deals with all the time in medical ethics. Fiction makes them real. Fiction can make you appreciate what these things mean in the lives of actual people. And that's the only reason they matter in the first place.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, actually, because one of the things that there are some of my students here, I think, tonight, and one of the things I'm always banging on about is that actually most illness is not experienced with professionals. It's experienced in your own lives, away, in private, etc. And one of the things, and so much for that I think you show, is the impact that this system, this monolithic system, has on all sorts of different people. So there's a family living with disability, a young person living with disability. There's a character who makes a choice to have elective surgery somewhat unwisely. And then there's
in a very unwise place.
You have to read it now. If you weren't going to read it, you must read it now. And then there are the central couples, Glynis and Shep, whose lives are decimated. I mean, one of the questions I had as somebody who doesn't live or work in the US system is, who is the system meant to serve?
Ultimately, the system is meant to serve the system. That is what most systems are for, right? And some people do very well out of the system. But it is not working, and I'm afraid that Obamacare, while it is better than it was, is not ultimately addressing the central problem, which you have too, I'm afraid, which is the escalating cost of health care and how much of a big piece of the national pie health care is taking up. And of course, that's, as we are relentlessly told, to do with the aging population and the fact that we are living longer. And it forces us to make some very difficult choices. This country is much better at facing those choices head on, where the U.S. is kidding itself.
What do you mean by that?
I think the biggest difference between our countries in terms of medical culture is realism versus sentimentality. Americans are sentimental. They are sentimental about human life itself. And they get very squeamish whenever you start pushing the point of, well, how could you possibly have any system where it was possible to spend an infinite amount of money on the survival of one person? That's just no economy can work that way. But Americans do not believe that you should ever draw a line and say, you can't have that treatment, it doesn't work well enough, and it's too expensive. Whereas here, I know that NICE is not well liked, but, and that's an understatement, but it is a necessity, and I am a big admirer of its very existence. The NHS has to pick its spots. It cannot buy all the drugs, it cannot offer all the treatments, and it has to be able to be brutal, and and use the funds it's got to do the greatest good for the greatest number. And that means that some people are going to get a bit shortchanged. And when you're dealing with life and death, that's controversial. That is what all of the West has to deal with right now. Actually, the whole world, really.
There's an American professor of ethics who described the NHS to me as muddling along elegantly, which seemed to me both to romanticise and probably not be terribly accurate, but it's a nice phrase. I wonder, do you think we're muddling along elegantly? Or inelegantly, even?
Well, muddling along, however you do it, is good enough. I read the papers. I'm concerned about what the financial future of the NHS is. It doesn't add up. The burden of geriatric patients on the hospitals in particular is already out of control, never mind what's going to happen, because they are occupying a too large proportion of beds. And it's obviously connected with difficulties in social care and inadequate council contributions to caring for people in their homes and all of it. I mean, it's just this huge, big problem. And I don't know what the way forward is, but I have sometimes argued that the NHS probably has to slim down its range of services so that maybe there's some things it doesn't do anymore. Something even like fertility treatment, which is great. And if I wanted a child, I would want the NHS to help me. I'm sympathetic with the desire to have a child and to get the NHS to help you, but maybe we can't afford that. And maybe we have to look at a number of things which are ultimately elective and say we can't do that anymore.
So if we're going to do that, I guess there are two questions. The first is how we do it, but also who the we in that sentence is. Is it a bunch of people in a room who are expert in some way? And if so, what is that expertise? Or is it a more democratic process? There are examples of that. They've usually failed, but there are examples of community decisions being made about what we prioritise in health.
Well, I don't know how to do it logistically. It's not ultimately going to be a democratic decision, and I bet we don't have referenda on different services that the NHS offers. It's always difficult politically to take things away from people. It's very easy to increase benefits, to increase the services that something like the NHS offers, but it's a very different matter to withdraw them, and that makes people very angry. But what worries me about what's going to inevitably happen if with not being methodical about it, you just have increasingly sort of crap medical care in the NHS, then you are inviting a more American system where the people who can afford it are going to split off and get private care. And I think that kind of fiscal apartheid is culturally unfortunate. I really like the fact that a fair number of well-to-do people still go to NHS doctors and are in the system. And that's the way it should work. But if you just let it deteriorate, money's good for something, and one of the things it's good for is getting better medical care, and that's the way people are going to spend it.
So where would you rather be a patient? Here or the US?
Well, in that I don't have any health insurance in the US, I'd much rather do that.
Okay, and That's probably a really good time for your reading, which I think
Okay.
brings out some of these issues writ large. So Lionel's going to read to us now. It's a point in the book. I'll let Lionel introduce it properly. But it's a point in the book where Glynis's husband is talking to Dr. Goldman, a doctor who perhaps lacks some of the warmth, empathy and communication skills one might hope for.
He's probably better than some doctors. Yes, this is my protagonist talking to his wife's oncologist. And as you can see, it's rather near the end of the book, so Glynis is not doing very well. And earlier in this conversation, Dr. Goldman has tried to encourage Shep to consider getting Glynis to take an experimental drug which would not be covered by his insurance and would cost $100,000. It's called paratoximel. I made that up. It was really fun. I realize this is just what you people do, said Shep. It's the way you're programmed. You just keep plowing through the drugs, working down the list, keeping everyone's chin up, looking on the bright side, never saying die. My wife, for example, never says die. Honestly, I can't remember the last time I heard her use the D word. Nobody in this biz is ever supposed to throw up their hands and call it quits, so long as there's any last teensy-weensy, teeny tiny smidgen of a chance that some new therapy will eke out a few extra days. So you've just been following the script. But can we, for once, with Glynis not here, drop the pretense? This experimental drug you're pushing. You don't really believe it will make any difference, do you? I did say it was a long shot. What are the odds? 50 to 1? Willing to put any of your own money on that? It's hard to put a number on. Let's just say the chances are distant. Me, I wouldn't put $100,000 on distant, even if I were a betting man. Would you? Goldman declined to answer. Secondly, let's skip the I don't believe in making prognoses thing. You've been around the block. You know more about mesothelioma than anyone in the country. You're an expert. So tell me, how long has she got? The expression on Goldman's face reminded Shep of wrestling in his childhood, sitting on a boy's chest and pinning each wrist to the ground, and he finally got his friend to cry uncle. Maybe a month, possibly more like 3 weeks. Shep crimped forward as if from a gut punch. I realize that's difficult to hear, Goldman continued softly. And I'm very, very sorry. 3 weeks was within the range that Shep had forecast himself, but it was different hearing the bleak estimate from a doctor. As Shep recovered himself, the oncologist filled the silence. I think of all the patients I've ever had, your wife must have shown the most tremendous spirit. She's put up a truly admirable struggle. That's nice of you to say. And I realize you're trying to pay her a big compliment. But this way of thinking. Shep stood up and paced the small patch of carpet before the door. Struggle, surmounting the odds. Like the online support group that Glynis joined for a while was always talking up hanging tough, refusing to let go, not giving up, going the last mile. You'd think they were organizing a grammar school sports day. Dr. Goldman, my wife is very competitive. She's a high achiever, a perfectionist. A striver like that? How's she not going to rise to this stuff? And then you guys jack up the stakes even more. It's not just a potato sack race, it's a war. The battle against cancer, the arsenal at our disposal. You make her think there's something she has to do to be a good soldier, a real trooper. So if she deteriorates anyway, then there's something she didn't do. She didn't show courage under fire. I know you mean well, but after all this military talk, she now equates dying with dishonor, with failure, with personal failure. It was the first time Shep had put it together for himself. The military language is just a metaphor, said Goldman. A way of talking about medical issues that laymen understand. It's not meant to hold the patient accountable for a therapy's results. But for Glynis, when you admire her struggle, she thinks you blame her when it doesn't do any good, don't you see? That's why she won't quit. That's why she and I can't talk about, well, anything. I see no reason for her to quit. Glynis, Mrs. Knacker, takes heart from her tenacity. Since I've come to know her somewhat, I think I would counsel you to keep my prognosis to yourself. What's one more secret? Said Shep morosely, plopping back in his chair. Though that's a fucking big secret. I'm only thinking of preserving the quality of the time she has left. Keep her upbeat. But won't she know what's going on in her own body? You'd be surprised. Not necessarily. Still, I'd advise you to contact her family and friends. Underscore, we're talking about days or weeks, but not months. And they mustn't delay a last visit. So they can say goodbye. What good is saying goodbye when you can't say goodbye? Pardon. If we're not telling Glynis, nobody can say goodbye. Not even I can say goodbye. Well, sometimes hasta la vista is just as warm. But it's easier to hear, isn't it? And we say see you later to all kinds of people whom we will never meet again, really. I guess, Shep said reluctantly. Maybe you're right. Glynis doesn't want to hear it. She sure hasn't wanted to hear anything else. I suppose I can see why you might want to pass on the paradoxamal. But she was very eager to take it. If you want to keep her on an even keel, I could prescribe a placebo. His wife's final days being webbed in a skein of deceit depressed Shep more than he could say. Maybe. I'll let you know. Meanwhile, keep me apprised of her condition and contact me if you need any advice about how to keep her comfortable. There is something you could do, said Shep, looking at his lap. I really don't want her to die in hospital, but I also don't want her to experience any more pain than she has to. I'd like something to ease the end. There's nothing easy about the end. It can be very unpleasant. Professionals have a better chance of keeping her comfortable. Repeated at least 3 times now, the set phrase jarred. Shep suspected that the medical establishment's usage of comfortable strained the definition of the word. Are you sure you don't want to reconsider about the hospital? The doctor pressed. You feel strongly about this. I do. And I honestly think that if Glynis ever faces up to what's happening, she'll feel the same way too. Painkillers are controlled substances. We're closely watched by the FDA. I can't hand out capsules willy-nilly because of the danger of addiction. The government is afraid that my wife will become a drug addict when she's dying. Goldman sighed. I grant it's not all that rational. He bit his lip. This is a little risky, but I suppose I could give you a prescription for liquid morphine. It's not complicated, just a few drops on her tongue when she seems uncomfortable, said Shep, with a trace of his earlier sourness. He stood up. Thank you. And what I said before, my tone. I didn't mean I'm not grateful. I know you're grateful, Mr. Necker. And I'm sorry I haven't been able to do more for your wife. We've tried everything we could, as you observed. But mesothelioma is a virulent, deadly disease. It's not for nothing that asbestos means inextinguishable in Greek. And you're a repairman, so you understand there are only so many tools in the toolbox. After they'd shaken hands and he was leaving, Shep turned back in the doorway. One last thing. The surgery, all the chemo, the blood transfusions, the chest drains, the MRIs. According to my calculations, Glynis's medical bills for all these treatments already come to over $2 million. That sound about right to you? It's plausible, the doctor conceded. So, what exactly did we buy? How much time? Oh, I bet we've probably extended her life a good 3 months. No, I'm sorry, Dr. Goldman, Shep said on the way out. They were not a good 3 months.
There's so much in that passage that we could pick up, and maybe people will have questions about it. I mean, there were two things about that interested me. I mean, I think one of the things was not so much whether the money had been well spent, which clearly it almost certainly hadn't been, but actually what services hadn't been considered that might have been much more helpful to Glynis and Shep. And thinking about health and social care in its broader sense, actually, these very expensive, highly interventionist pathways, there's limited mention, if any, I think, of palliative care, of other sorts of care that you
Well,
might
of course,
end up
palliative care is
with.
by definition not trying to address the ailment. And the trouble is that when you give almost all patients the option between palliative care and real treatment that offers, however slender a chance of remission or more time, people take the potentially curative, always. It's just incredible. And I've just gone through this in my own family. And I'm very torn about this because my father was diagnosed with lymphoma in September, and it was all over his body. It was in all of his vital organs, including the liver and the heart. Now, I realize that lymphoma is technically a curable cancer, but it was quite advanced, and so was my father's age. He was then 85 and has meantime turned 86. And my father has always talked a very good line, a very persuasive line about how much he didn't want money wasted on end-of-life care. In his case, he didn't want his own money eroded because he has charities that he wants to give to. And much to my surprise, both of my parents immediately opted to treat it to the max. It was very expensive. The chemo almost killed him numerous times. My brother and I were intensely dubious as to whether or not this was worth the agony. But he pulled through it. He's still here. He was given a PET scan recently, and there isn't any cancer left. I was floored. And when I say I'm torn, I wonder if in a medical sense and in a moral sense, my feeling that he shouldn't have received that treatment was still correct. And I'm talking about my own father. So I know that makes me sound like a monster. But I have no idea how much it cost. It would have been covered mostly by Medicare, which is like having the NHS cover it. And my father is not the same on the other side. I mean, he's written numerous books. He can no longer work a computer. He can no longer even type. I think there's not enough talked about the cognitive decline that sometimes comes with chemo. And I'm not too sure I like seeing my father in this state. I would have liked to see him go out on a high note, which we hardly ever get to do. But what is especially interesting about this case is that I would have said, don't do it. He would have died. In a way, I was wrong, right? And that kind of hard-nosed brutality that I'm commending was wrong.
Is it wrong, or is it actually revealing how morally complex this all is?
It's incredibly complicated.
But it's more than that, isn't it? It's not just right, wrong, oh, it's complicated, it's a bit in the middle. It's actually, you can hold contradictory thoughts and feelings. You can have a rational response. You can have an emotional response. Yes, I don't believe in wasting money on
end-of-life treatment. I am about to turn 86, and I want you to spend another couple of $1 million, just what was spent on Glynis, to keep me alive. I don't care for how little a time or in how compromised a condition. And you can hold those opinions and those feelings at the same time. But I'm just saying that if my parents opted for this kind of a radical treatment at my father's age, then anybody would. Anybody.
I want to talk a bit about families now. Moving on slightly. I mean, so much for that. We got a flavour of Shep's role as a carer. And I think one of the things that you do so well in all your books, but actually particularly these two, is you manage your relationships always feel authentic. And one of the reasons they always feel authentic, I think, is because the person is changed by the event, the precipitating event, whatever that might be, but also the relationships, and there is constancy of self and relationships. So for me, Shep and Glynis is pretty difficult, and she remains pretty difficult.
Yes.
She doesn't become saintly or martyred or she's not a good patient in any sense. Shep tries really hard to be saintly, and it all falls apart when Glynis goads him into a particularly memorable encounter. And then thinking about Big Brother, you've got a sibling relationship there. And although they've come together in this extraordinary set of circumstances, at the heart, this sibling relationship preserves, doesn't it? It's there, and they fall back into their old ways of staying up late and talking about things that they used to talk about when they were kids.
I should just, in that we're kind of segueing to the next book, I should explain, I've written 2 books in a row that pertain to this kind of a health and well-being occasion. In fact, when I suggested the idea for my last book to my editor, she didn't like it because she said it was too medical. So I guess it's probably just a sign that I'm getting old. So I'm interested in medical issues, but Big Brother is about fat, and in particular, it's about a sister whose older brother comes to visit and shows up at the airport, and she looks straight at him and fails to recognize him because he has gained so much weight in the 4 years since they last saw each other that he's unrecognizable. And the book is about how, coming to terms with how this happened and whether she's going to do something about it herself. Is she going to try to intervene?
So do you have a duty to care for a family member?
I think most of us feel some duty toward parents. I think most parents feel an almost total duty toward children. I think siblings, once they are grown, have a choice. And you can decide you really don't want to have much to do with one of your siblings because maybe you didn't ever get on as kids, and now you can go your separate ways. And I think that culturally we allow siblings in the West to disavow each other if they so choose. I mean, I admire it, but you have permission to abandon your siblings. It sounds horrible.
Where does that permission come from?
It's just an adult sibling relationship is up to you. And you can also go the other direction and choose to embrace each other and choose to embrace responsibility for each other and relish what you have in common. I tend to go more that direction, in case you're worried. I have treasured both my brothers, and I find it a very interesting relationship, and I think one of the things that makes it especially rich in adulthood is that elective quality, that you choose to stay in touch and you choose to concern yourselves with each other's lives, and you don't absolutely have to.
You mentioned your brothers, and the book is dedicated to Greg, who died of an
That's my older brother,
obesity-related illness. How was writing the book something such a personal experience?
It was useful. You know, although I tried to keep the story in the book separate enough from the story of my family and what happened with obesity in my family, so that I had a sense of perspective and that almost surgical sense of, you know, it's over here. You can shape it and tinker with it. It's emotionally useful. It introduces a sense of objectivity. So I made up the whole story, and in that it is about a woman who at a midpoint in the book does decide to take responsibility for her brother. It's in many ways about what I didn't do or never had an opportunity to do. There was never a point at which I really had an option on rescuing my older brother. And of course the book also raises the question as to whether or not that is ever possible.
You mentioned that Pandora, the sister, does step up, as it were. Does she do the right thing? Is that the ethical thing to do?
I suppose it would be the ethical thing to do if you were up for it and it worked. I think when you've got a relative who has a substance problem, you know, be it alcoholism, drug abuse, or overeating, it's all stuff. I have to admit, I'm a little skeptical about your ability to step in and solve the problem. There's no substitute for that person deciding to solve it themselves. There are ways that you can be helpful on the side. You know, if your brother's an alcoholic, I suppose you don't invite him to wild drinks parties. I mean, duh. But as much as this book is about a form of intervention, I'm very skeptical about their efficacy.
I was struck by what you said. You said it was ethical if it worked.
Yes.
Why does it need to work to be ethical?
Oh, otherwise it's just gesturing to make yourself feel better.
Really?
Yes.
So unless care works, it's pointless.
Well, you can't know what the results are before you start in on any project. So the test of that will be, yes, whether it works. Now, there is at least something to be said for expressing concern and tenderness, and in a way that involves some self-sacrifice on your part. And and that may have its own efficacy. When the sister announces to her brother in this novel that she is willing to move into a separate apartment away from her own family and spend many months with him and even go on a diet with him because she's a little overweight herself. The brothers really bowled over that she would make that big sacrifice for him. And insofar as it does work, it is partly because of that emotional the element that he has been so moved by her concern for him.
And there are other small moments of compassion that I think, as a reader, I thought were inherently good. So there's a moment when his niece hugs him. She hugs him in a completely uninhibited, loving way. And Pandora wonders, when he was last touched like that, when anybody just was genuinely, spontaneously kind to him. And I think, I actually think you're slightly underselling the weight of compassion that there is in this book.
I certainly hope that it's a compassionate
novel. It is a
novel.
compassionate novel.
And
yeah.
I might be skeptical only about this intervention issue,
okay.
But it is a book that is trying to stop being quite so hectoring about the weight thing. I think a lot of even the NHS approach to obesity backfires. It's a little prissy, and why don't you just stop eating so much? Why don't you just have a good diet and go out and get more exercise and lose weight? It's not that simple. Easy for you to say. I mean, if you go on these NHS websites, I would just find them incredibly irritating. And this is
anyone from NHS Choices in the house?
This is a novel that's trying to look at things in a more holistic way, to acknowledge that this is an emotional issue and a social issue as well as a medical one. And I think even in our discourse about the subject, we are constantly confusing the whole health argument about obesity. And it was in the paper this morning about one more time about how much obesity and diabetes are costing the NHS. Chide. Well, there's the health issue, but it gets mixed up with aesthetics, what we think is attractive. And also this weird competitive thing, social competition.
Yeah.
I'm better than you are because I'm thin and I'm fit. And it's disgusting. That kind of thing, it actually just drives me to ice cream.
There is a wonderful character, the insufferable Fletcher, who I think acts as a proxy for a lot of that. I mean, Edison is heartbreakingly rendered, I think. You see that he is lonely, the loss of dignity, the emotional and the social is so much more part of the problem than the number on the scale, it seems to me, throughout the book. And actually, there have been other books written about obesity. I think Heft is one, and the Mittelstein book was another one. But actually, for me, this is the one that best captures just the loneliness of this, both the increased visibility, but also the diminishing nature of Edgar and his place in the world.
Well,
Edison in
I
his
thank
place in
you
the
for
world.
that, because I haven't read those books. I was sick of this subject by the time I produced the book. But you're right about that there's a weird way, there's a great irony in the fact that the more you weigh, the less you're seen.
Yeah.
And I saw that very close up with my own older brother, that all that other people could see was some fat guy. It was very painful. He was an incredibly accomplished person. And he became socially invisible.
Yeah. Can we have a reading
Sure.
for Big Brother? Thanks.
Okay, the brother in the book, Edison, visits his sister for far longer than she was quite prepared for. And this point in the book, it's been almost 2 months. Her brother is a jazz musician and has been living in New York, though we know he has fallen on hard times. He no longer has a place to live in New York. He's been couch surfing. And he's been talking up this big deal tour of Spain and Portugal that's coming up, and it's been ringing a little bit hollow in a way that his sister doesn't pay attention to because she's desperate to get rid of him. It sounds unkind, but we were all eyeing with desperation the red letter day of November 29th, the date of my brother's return flight to New York. In our defense, having a guest of any size for 2 whole months is trying for most people. Making conversation was exhausting. Our laundry burden had increased. 3 of Edison's voluminous outfits filled out a washer load. Mornings, we were constantly out of half and half when we were stocking the stuff by the half-gallon. My brother was not a physically careful person, which had for weeks expressed itself in a series of small damages that still added up to a sustained sense of violation. He experimented with my stovetop milk steamer and left it on high to run dry. He melted the rubber gasket and blew out the safety valve. He used a metal spatula on my favorite nonstick sauté pan. He broke one of the finely etched wine glasses I'd inherited from our paternal grandparents. Boiling water for pasta, he'd placed a Revereware pot off-center on the burner, and flames licked up the side to overheat the handle. The kitchen reeked for hours of melted plastic. Alas, in the advancing season, he'd taken on building fires in the fireplace, but employing the same quantity that typified everything he put his hand to, devastating our supply of kindling and burning black spots with rolling coals into our hearthside Persian carpet. Edison continued to keep unsociable hours, so when I awoke, I tiptoed downstairs and refrained from listening to the radio while I made my toast, lest I disturb our slumbering house guest overhead. On the other hand, I preferred these mornings to the ones after Edison had found tackling the stairs too much of a drain and slept in his clothes in the maroon recliner downstairs, obliging the whole family to church mouse through breakfast and make do with juice or tea because running the coffee grinder would wake him up. And Edison had sleep apnea. However grating his heavy snore, the long silences during which he stopped breathing altogether disturbed us more. The loud snorts with which these deathly respites concluded were startling, but still a relief. Given a taint invading the ground floor, I doubted he always smoked out on the patio when the rest of the family was out or abed, especially now that into November it was getting cold. Whenever he did amble out the sliding door and back in again, he dropped the temperature not 5 degrees, but 10. As if he regarded himself as currently on the road and therefore in the care of hotel staff, my brother's contribution to keeping the house clean was to get in the way of the vacuum cleaner. We'd kept our decor minimal, the better to feature my husband Fletcher's handmade furniture. But lately it featured Edison's dirty dishes, broken down slippers, and splayed copies of Downbeat instead. Fletcher was a neat man with a spare aesthetic. The first thing he did on emerging from the basement or returning from a bike ride was collect this detritus, lips pressed into an M-dash. My brother routinely forgot that my husband's furniture was oiled, not varnished, and cups on the rosewood coffee table would leave rings without a coaster. Since the collateral damage of my brother's Midwestern sabbatical was by the transitive property all my fault, I would skulk in my husband's wake with a stick of Land O'Lakes to vanquish the circles with rubbed-in butter. The while wondering if I had learned this trick from our mother, why my brother had not. Whenever Edison showered in the upstairs bathroom, The mat got soaked along with the floor, and anyone walking in soon after would muddy the tiles with footprints. The guest room was a nest of soiled clothes I had regularly to harvest myself, now cratered down the middle like a half-dug grave. The mattress would have to be replaced. I hadn't concerned myself with the arbitrary dart-in-a-calendar spirit in which Edison had chosen his return date when we changed his airline reservation back in October. Presumably, once back in New York, he was expecting to stay with colleagues for a day or two before heading off with a band to Barcelona. A lack of specificity about his many other bookings through the spring caused me an unease whose scrutiny I avoided. According to Edison, he'd be making enough money off the tour of Spain and Portugal to put down a deposit on a new apartment and haul his things out of storage. I'd proposed to augment his earnings, too, if that would help him land his own place again, although there was an ugly side to this offer, more than a suggestion that I would pay my brother not to come back here. That had been the concept all along, right? That this stay in our house would see him through a professional dry patch. Presto, he could return from his European tour with cash in pocket, ready to reestablish himself in the Big Apple and attend to his busy schedule. It had all made sense on paper until I laid eyes on him. But I felt I'd done my bit, you see. I thought my whole family had done more than its bit. Only in retrospect do I appreciate this doing your bit is a deadly misapprehension of the nature of familial ties. Better understanding them now, I find blood relationships rather frightening. What is wonderful about kinship is also what is horrible about it. There is no line in the sand, no natural limit to what these people can reasonably expect of you. When I moved to Iowa and stayed for 2 solid years with my grandparents, I was often apologetic about not having found a job and apartment. My grandmother used to pat my hand warmly and say, "Why, the very definition of family, dear, is the folks who will take you in." I'd found her paraphrase of Robert Frost comforting at the time, but during this long fraternal visit, that aphorism had come back to bite me. Ergo, what Edison could reasonably expect of me was potentially infinite. I now recognize that responsibility, once assumed, cannot be readily repudiated, not without doing so much damage in the process of its abdication that you might as well never have assumed the responsibility in the first place. Whether or not I realized it when I first sent that plane ticket and $500 check, I had taken Edison on. All however many 100 pounds of him. This contract had no end date of November 29th if you studied the fine print. There are instances where pet owners are overwhelmed and leave dogs they didn't realize would be so much trouble at the SPCA. Foster parents have second thoughts and return unruly charges to the state. But flesh and blood family works in only one direction.
I think this is probably a good point to open it up for questions. Lionel, I feel you've said quite a few things that people might be interested in asking you about or picking up. So we have some mics. There is a very strict rule that you must not speak until you have the mic. But once you have the mic, please go for it. And I'm going to try and chair this. So if you can wave at me once you have the mic, or wave, no, that's not going to work. Wave to get the mic. That's what you need to do. Wave to get the mic, and then we'll take it from there. So yes, down here, thank you, in the third row.
Thank you. Is it working?
It is working.
First, a congratulation, then a question. I'm a lung doctor, and so mesothelioma and sleep apnea is what I do.
Wow.
And I congratulate you on getting it absolutely right, some of the time. The point is that this question I have, which is a very serious question, is whether society and families overvalue life. Because your description of a death from mesothelioma isn't the way it always happens. And very often when people are dying...
It's a little romanticized, actually.
They don't mind whether they're going to die on Thursday or Friday. A lot of other people do mind.
Yes.
The family minds, the system minds, and society minds. And I'd like you to hear your views as to whether we just, all of us, overvalue life.
That's an interesting way of putting it. I guess that's a slightly different version of what I was accusing the Americans of, which is being sentimental. And yes, I think we are sentimental about life. And I would put forward the very controversial view that all life is not equal. And we want to treat and that's it's a nice idea that all life is equal. But I don't think my life is as valuable as someone who's 10 years old. I really don't. And, I'm 57. I've already had a great life. If something happened to me tomorrow, it would be too bad, but it wouldn't be a tragedy because I've had a great time. And one of the things that seems to be happening lately is that we're trending toward spending all our money on old people. So, and that's really where the sentimentality comes in, and it's extremely awkward because even the very notion that old people are not as valuable as young people, it's anathema, and it's especially anathema to old people. And you can't have NH doctors actually submitting this, but yes, we overvalue keeping everyone alive for as long as possible in whatever form at any cost. And that, if you put it that way, it sounds absurd, but the American approach is just that. And we were talking about this earlier, there's a case that I mentioned in So Much for That, the Terry Schiavo case. Do you remember that?
Very well.
Yeah. It drove me crazy. And one of the things that drove me, do you remember this? I'll refresh your memories. I'm sure it did get covered over here. It was a woman who was brain dead, okay? This was in Florida. Her name was Terry Schiavo, and it was time to pull the plug. She'd been in a persistent vegetative state for years, and it was a huge issue. It didn't even go to Congress. It was ridiculous. One of the things that angered me about the discussion is that nobody ever mentioned money. Nobody ever talked about how much it cost to keep her, however nominally or technically alive. That never entered the conversation. And nobody also talked about how much money we wasted trying to decide whether to pull the plug. I mean, it went through in so many different court cases. It was a huge squandering of resources. But that was overvaluing life to the max. It was absurd. So yeah, I agree with you. I'm sorry, that's your job.
It's fine. I do it a lot. It's fine.
Hello. Is it working? The discussion about the £2 million and the 4 months, the 3 months that it gave him, was there any discussion at the beginning of how long it would give her? Do you know what I mean? Because
No.
Is the anger because she was promised to have a long life, or is that the way to work out how to spend this money?
There was plenty of information available about what the prognosis. I mean, after all, if you want to know, you can go on the web today, right? And Glynis doesn't want to know. You know, even in that scene, her husband is talking about, you know, Glynis didn't want to know about anything else, so why should she want to know that she's about to die? She refuses to find out what is very readily available to her. And I think one of the things that I'm sympathetic with doctors over is that quandary of how much to tell patients, how much they ask, how much to foist on them whether they want to know it or not. I think that's very awkward. And the other thing that's hard for doctors is it's one thing to know what the general figures are, but those are pretty useless in an individual instance. They're not necessarily going to be accurate. And when you're trying to decide whether a treatment is worth it, well, you don't know. You don't know how much. It probably would have been irresponsible of the doctor to say up front, well, we're going to buy you 3 more months, because he wouldn't have known. And that's one of the ways that you get into these ultimately situations of over-treatment and squandering large amounts of money, because there's always a chance that it will actually be very successful. And you don't have the result when you're here. And I think that's hard for the patients and it's hard for the doctors.
But might that be a reason for not just making decisions on the basis of economic prediction and consequences, but actually thinking about values or thinking about underpinning things like dignity or whatever it might be, but that actually there are values that you use to guide what you do rather than just the crystal ball gazing of economics. I'm guessing that most doctors don't have economics in their heads a lot of the time, and if they were, it's in this prevailing uncertainty. But actually, if you think, is it dignified to continue with treatment in this context, or what is the cost to dignity? You may get to the moral question, but you get to it perhaps by a more reliable is the wrong word, but a more considered way, potentially.
Yes, well, I think that's what I was getting at in relation to the condition that my father is in right now, that I feel that his dignity has been compromised. But that's another result that you're not going to know in advance.
Yeah. Okay. This question down here in the third row at the end. Then one more.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed, let's talk about Kevin particularly.
Thank you.
When I lived in Alberta, we were all given at the end of the year a summary of our doctor's visits or whatever, and how much it had cost.
Really? Mm-hmm. Isn't that interesting?
I don't know if they still do it. This was a while ago. It will bypass a lot of people. They'll just say, well, I don't know. They'll just think it's their due. But it certainly hit home to me. And I'm wondering if this wouldn't be an idea that you could promote, because people listen to you, even though you're a woman.
Not nearly enough.
It's worth promoting that they did this. It would be quite easy with technology, as a segue into making some of the harder choices. Because I don't think, I've just been in an emergency recently, and I was just appalled at the way people were slagging off the staff. They were doing a terrific job under the circumstances, and, it's free.
Supposedly.
Then let's forget it.
Yeah. I think one of the complications of the situation in Britain, and one of the complications with your idea, if you're suggesting that we do that with UK patients, is a lot of older people have been paying into the system their whole life, and there's a sense of entitlement, that, and not just real entitlement, not the way that word is often used. That is, you have paid for this. You have been paying your taxes for decades for this, and finally you need the care. And someone who's been contributing to the system all this time is not going to feel especially bad to look at that set of charges, because that's your taxes coming back. And it's difficult. I think it's difficult when you have that sense of being due to feel, oh dear, gosh, that's a lot of money.
And it might be that, we know that some groups will hold off seeking care if they perceive themselves to be a burden. So actually the sickest may not present till late, they may not turn up. So actually the desired effect may in fact be counterintuitive and harmful. There's a question at the back.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks. I did find your lecture really interesting because especially I work with people with mental health problems, especially younger people. And I was wondering if you think sort of like, we sort of transferred that I wasn't talking about cancer in your book, that you're talking about mental illness in particular. Do you think that society would be quite so willing to spend, or people and family members would be quite so willing to spend that kind of money? Because I met a lady today, she was a carer, and she said, I could take the deaths of family members, I could take the death of my husband, but the worst punishment I'll ever have, and it's really stuck with me, amazing thing that happened to me today, was having a son with mental health problems. That is the worst punishment. And that really struck me, and that was said by someone today, and that is a very real thing. Just touching about sort of things about the sentimentality of life, people will sort of say, I could never have mental health problems. That would be worse than anything. I would rather die than that. I just sort of wanted to sort of see with your thinking in the process of what you said and you write in your book, if you had any thoughts on that. And it's a really bad question, I'm sorry.
I think it's an excellent question, actually.
Well, what is the question?
Okay. The question
what is the excellent question?
So is the question that actually for mental illness or mental distress, that is a group where the caring burden is greater or different or perceived to be greater or different. And so it might be, what does it mean to care for the most vulnerable or the most stigmatized or the most marginalized? Are families going to step up and do that?
Well, they do. They don't. You find families don't step up and take care of their own son or something?
Yeah, there are some cases, but there's also cases where it's like, you're not going to see, I'm not coming to see you today, I'm not coming to visit you because you're not well. My mother cared for my grandmother, who had manic depression. Her brothers and sisters quite frequently wouldn't come along on the days that it didn't suit them when she was a little bit more high or low, asking for bribes. Oh, if I'm going to bring the grandchild, I need to see some money. So I think there's a real sort of that stigma about mental illness will make people go away and make them cut off much faster than anything else. And I suppose just to sort of think about...
I think mental illness is especially upsetting. It's disturbing to people. And if the person who is starting to go off, that person becomes... I think the experience is that they're becoming a stranger to you. And as they become a stranger, I suspect that loosens a sense of obligation because it's not the person you knew, is it? Well, they've turned into some weirdo that whom you do not understand anymore. Yeah, and can't talk to, can't communicate with. And, that's... It's worse than they're just feeling poorly, But for that matter, one of the things that I addressed often when I was doing the promotion for So Much for That is the fact that people desert one another in droves when someone becomes ill. And I would think that would be raised to a power with mental illness for the reasons that I'm saying. That, this whole idea that you visit the sick, it's gone to hell. People don't visit the sick. It's shocking. It's, I don't want to bother them. They're probably not feeling very well. We come up with all kinds of excuses. And I would think that with mental illness, it's even worse.
I think we've got time for 2 more questions, and I can see too many hands. I'm going to go to this side of the room because I'm aware that I haven't been. So, Beth, I think, yeah.
Hello. Thank you for your talk tonight. It's been brilliant. But I'm curious in terms of a question of value being reduced to monetary terms, and I realise that obviously value is money is a difficult thing, and we only have so much of it in a country. But in terms of people's contribution, life contributes so much more than monetary value. I was interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, what I was just talking about has nothing to do with money. Caring for each other has nothing to do with money. And one of some of the issues that have come up in the NHS recently really have to do with callousness, not lack of funds, right? But sometimes the neglect that has been uncovered has been traced to some understaffing. But it's worse than that. It's been nurses and carers who just can't be bothered to give someone a drink of water. Drink water practically, it's free. It's just bothering. Now, all those neglect cases get an awful lot of press, and I think we know that it's not fair to the NHS and not at all representative, and certainly not representative of any interaction I've had with NHS healthcare. But the whole constellation of medical ethics issues, it's only part of them are fiscal, and otherwise it's social and emotional, and being willing to take care of each other. One of the big things that my generation is going to have to contend with is, are we willing to take our own parents in? And that has an element of money, but it's also whether you can stick having your parents in your house all the time. And so the kind of sacrifices that we may be asked to make, because this whole thing of putting everybody in care homes and that it is too expensive, and there are going to be a lot of us that are going to have to face down whether or not we're ready to have that kind of multi-generational household that was once considered a thing of the past. And it may be one way that we deal with the so-called aging population. And these are social issues. They're not just fiscal ones.
And moral issues.
And very moral issues.
One more question. Yes, you were first. Go on. Speedy arms.
Just picking up on that, I heard a professor of geriatric medicine talking recently, and he thinks kind of fiscally there is no solution to that social care problem, that it costs too much money.
Did he think that, as I was saying, that more people in my generation are actually going to have to take their parents in?
Possibly. His suggestion, which is kind of a different one as to how to deal with it, is actually that the only way to make it work would be pretty much time banking from everybody, kind of from your 20s or 30s onwards. That his view is that no government's going to be able to fund this, essentially. No. There just will not be the money available. Some families will take parents or grandparents or whoever in, some won't be able to, some won't be willing to. And so, his kind of suggestion on this is basically you start putting time in from your 20s or 30s that you then get to claim back when you're old and need it. Yeah. Which, this is already a system that exists. Kind of there are such things as time banks, and you can go, well, we'll spend 10 hours gardening. I will then claim that back later in 10 hours childcare or whatever, as a method of kind of, using voluntary time as a resource. So this was sort of his thought on how might we deal with this, because we don't seem to have a way to deal with it.
That's a very interesting proposal, but it only works for tomorrow's old people, because you have to start doing that when you're young. So that doesn't really get us over the hump.
No, I agree. It doesn't deal with today's old people. I guess I just wondered, what you thought about that, because not everybody has a family. So kind of moral issues
obviously,
aside.
we just have to expand assisted suicide.
Or not. Or we about each other. Who knows? On which note, I knew we would have a rich, rewarding and wide-ranging discussion. It has been more rich, more rewarding and more wide-ranging than I could ever have imagined. So I would like to thank you all for coming and for taking part so brilliantly, and particular thanks to Lionel and to Damien and to Liz for organising such a wonderful evening. Thank you.
There's not really very much more for me to say. I'm Damien Hebron. I'm the director of London Arts and Health Forum. Really, my role is to sort of speak on your behalf and thank Deborah and Lionel. I just want to quickly say it's a few other thank yous as well. Thank you to Liz and to the whole team here at Tate Modern for hosting this event. It's been the closing event in Creativity and Wellbeing Week, which has gone incredibly well. This is an annual week, a sort of festival of creativity and health and well-being. It's the third time that we've run it, and there's been hundreds of events in London, and there's events going on around the country through the summer. So if you are interested, and if you don't know very much about us or about the week, do have a look on our website, but also do come and join us for a cup of tea and to continue the conversation. If you want to leave, if you can go through that door, but also do use the door at the top of the stairs as well, because otherwise they'll end up with a real bottleneck. But that was all just sort of business. The main reason I'm standing up now is to say thank you on our behalf to Deborah and to Lionel. So thank you.